And apologize that I have a very tight schedule with international interviews coming right after, so I'll have to leave abruptly. And I'll just say a few words and then leave as much time as possible for discussion. I agree with the previous speakers that Latin America, to be precise, South America, is entering a period of enormous promise. In many ways, it's the most exciting area in the world today, I think. This is the first time since the first European contact and the horrendous collapse of the great civilizations of the Western Hemisphere. First time since then that I think one can look forward with some optimism towards a promising period ahead. Regrettably, I have to keep it to South America. Central America has not recovered from Reagan's terrorist wars and may never recover from them. And of course, there's a long, terrible history that I don't have to recount. It is a question why the promising developments in South America today have been so long delayed. It's a region with very rich resources, many advantages. In the late 19th century, the growth rate in Brazil was actually higher than in the United States, which was far and away the highest in the industrial world. Argentina was one of the richer countries in the world. In the 1920s, it was confidently predicted that Brazil was on its way to become what was called the Colossus of the South, counterpart to the Colossus of the North. For many reasons, that didn't happen. One of the reasons was that South America was living under the shadow of the Colossus of the North, which was not a benign shadow. But the primary reasons, I think, were internal to South America. And all of these issues are now being confronted, the internal ones and the external ones, and addressed, at least to some extent, overcome. The internal problems have to do with forms of disintegration, two kinds, actually. Internal to each country, there's a sharp, as you all know, a very sharp split between a tiny, wealthy elite, mostly white. There's a very close race-class correlation throughout the region. So a tiny, rich, white, mostly elite, and ruling over a vast sea of misery and oppression and suffering. And the wealthy have had no real responsibility for their own societies. It differs from other regions in this respect. We see it in many dimensions. So the comparison with East Asia in the last half century is revealing. Take, say, imports. Imports to South America have been skewed towards luxury consumption by the rich. East Asia have been directed to capital, import of capital, productive investment. With regard to export of capital, exports altogether is more or less the same. South America is still saddled with the raw materials export tradition of the past. East Asia, of course not. It's moved up quickly up the technological ladder. The same with export of capital. Export of capital flight from Latin America is roughly on the scale of the Prussian debt, which suggests a way to overcome that immense burden. East Asia was quite different. Export of capital was strictly controlled. In fact, in South Korea, during its major growth period, you could get the death penalty for exporting capital. The same is true of, say, taxation. East Asia is relatively egalitarian. South America is quite different, like the whole of Latin America. It's observed by Jorge Castaneda when he was appointed to the Fox administration. He was asked how, with his social democratic background, he was willing to demand taxes on essential goods like food, medicines, and so on. And his answer was pretty sensible. He said that in our countries, the rich avoid taxes, The mass of the poor have nothing. So the only choice is to skim the meager resources of those who can barely get by. And there's more than a little truth in that, unfortunately. And the same holds in general with regard to the attitude toward the neoliberal rule. The Washington Consensus the last several decades. Latin America adhered to them rigorously. The only region that had comparable rigor was sub-Saharan Africa. Both were a disaster. East Asia simply ignored and followed the path of the developed countries with heavy reliance on the state sector, state intervention. It's still true of the United States. The U.S. economy relies dramatically on the dynamic state sector. MIT is a significant proponent, usually not discussed in economic modeling, but it's really true if you look at facts. That's one form of disintegration internal to each country. Related to that is another form. Countries were separated from one another. The wealthy elites, the societies were oriented abroad, not to other countries. Second homes, cultural relations, capital export, and so on was the West, not internal. And that kind of disintegration is a very serious problem for the societies themselves, but it's also a barrier to independence. Independence is a virtual prerequisite for independence is integration of the society. So they simply can't be picked one after another by external forces, as has happened too often in the South in the past. Well, all of that is changing. It's changing in quite dramatic ways. In my view, one of the most dramatic ways it's changing has to do with just popular organization. There are mass popular organizations in South America, the kind that don't exist here, and they are the basis for real progress in democracy. We have a lot to learn from South America in that respect. The most dramatic example is the poorest country in South America, Bolivia. In December 2005, they had an election, free election of the kind that became green here. It's a comparison to political scientists, and in fact the general public would pay a lot more attention to. So there is a model of democracy here, which was recently articulated by the White House, pretty broad consensus. The White House spokesperson, Dana Perino, was asked by journalists why the administration is pursuing the Iraq war so intensely, even though the public is opposed to it. And she answered properly. She said, you had your input. The American people have an input every 4 years. That's the way our system works. The rest of the time, shut up. That's correct. That's the way the system works. Every 4 years, you have a chance to choose between two candidates whose views you oppose. And we know that the public opposes the views by extensive studies of public attitudes. But that's the way the system works. And the public's aware of it. It's no illusion. So 80% of the public thinks the country is run, whereas the polls are, by a few big interests looking out for themselves, and not for the benefit of the people. The public overwhelmingly opposes the model that Reno correctly described, which is a consensus across the spectrum, the educated spectrum. 95% of the public thinks the government should pay attention to public opinion all the time. We read this morning that 80% of the public thinks the country's going the wrong way, but they don't think they can do anything about it, even though it's an electoral view, because that's not the way the system works. Well, Bolivia was quite different. There was mass popular movements which elected somebody from their own ranks. The first time that the majority Indian population was able to enter the political arena actively and successfully. The issues were serious. Resource control, cultural rights, justice, and so on. It wasn't just a matter of pushing a button once every 4 years and then shutting up. These were struggles that have been underway for a long time, very active, sometimes unfortunately met with violent repression, and there was an election of real consequence. Well, that is a model of democracy that's foreign to the United States. Not totally. In the past, it's happened, but contemporary United States, which means that we can learn quite a lot about democracy promotion by looking at the poorest country in South America. That's not the only case. Actually, in varying degrees, this is happening throughout South America in many different ways. One instructive illustration are the regular polls of Latinobarometer, the Chilean polling agency taken every year. And they're quite interesting. The results are quite different from what I just described here in the United States. The assessment of satisfaction with democracy has in fact been increasing, not everywhere, but particularly dramatically in two countries, in Uruguay and Venezuela, which are ranked right at the top in satisfaction with democracy for the past several years. The assessment of current and future prospects, especially the economic situation, equality and justice, educational standards, rankings are also fairly high. Venezuela's way in the lead on those. Actually, Venezuela ranks only 11th in support for market systems, but despite that flaw from our point of view, it still ranks first in Latin America in matters of democracy, justice, optimism for future, support for the economic policies of the government, far above U.S. favorites. So obviously all of this can't be reported and isn't reported. But not that the polls are unknown. There's one part of the polls, one question in the polls that's regularly reported, and so everyone knows about it. That's the fact that in Latin America, outside Venezuela, the places Chavez ranks is almost as unpopular as Bush. That gets reported regularly, but not everything else that I've said. Reporting is unacceptable to our conception of the free press. There are concrete steps that are taking place, which are also very promising. So, last December, the Bank of the South was established. We get to see the other day it was established. It was a Venezuelan initiative. Participants are Bolivia, Brazil, Ecuador, Paraguay, and Uruguay. Others may join in. It could, if it's successful, become an alternative to the international financial institutions, which have had a very harmful effect in South America, particularly the IMF, which is its American executive director called the credit community's enforcer. They say it's being kicked out of country after country, which frees the countries from the stranglehold of a branch of the Treasury Department, which is effectively what the IMF is. Seems the right thing. If this takes off, it could be an independent source of integrated, independent development for the region, if it succeeds. Last week, some important steps were taken to firm up Brazilian-Venezuelan agreement on Venezuelan investment in the Brazilian refinery to process Venezuelan crude, which is part of the process. Well, again, that's an important step if it takes place, not the only example of Brazilian-Venezuelan interactions. Lula's first action after his re-election was to visit Caracas to support Chavez's election campaign, and also to dedicate a joint Venezuelan Brazilian project, which is over the Orinoco River, and for additional ones. None of this incidentally can get reported here because it's against doctrinal orthodoxy. The doctrinal orthodoxy is that, yes, and South Americans are moving to the left, questioning neoliberalism and so on, but there's a good left and a bad left, and they're poles apart. The good left is Lula, the bad left is Chavez, a couple of years hanging around. So therefore, the relations between them are effectively unreportable. But go to this. In December 2006, there was a major meeting of Latin American leaders in Cochabamba, which discussed plans for something like a European Union-style federation. Also, the relations among the leaders, and for that reason, also I presume that's the reason not reported. Well, these and many other steps which go on are highly unwelcome in Washington for obvious reasons. The leading principle of U.S. foreign policy with regard to Latin America has been described pretty accurately by the National Security Council in 1971, who pointed out that if the United States cannot control Latin America, it cannot expect to achieve a successful order elsewhere in the world. So if you want to run the world, you better at least be able to run your own backyard. That's a position that any mafia don would easily understand, and the world is much more like the mafia than is often recognized. The Godfather would simply not accept that kind of disobedience, and the Godfather would also be sympathetic to the Kennedy-Johnson position on Cuba, which we know from internal documents. They were particularly upset with the internal documents about Cuba, what they call Cuba's successful defiance of U.S. policies going back to the Monroe Doctrine. Well, that's really intolerable. The Monroe Doctrine, of course, was premature, but implemented at the time. But at the time, it came to be implemented, and now you have successful defiance of it, which is quite unacceptable. So therefore, it was taken for granted that it was legitimate to severely punish the people of Cuba by terror, strangulation, for this deviation from good order. It's unacceptable. And this kind of this crime of successful defiance is indeed continuing. A couple of days ago, or this week, the government of the parliament in Ecuador decided to close the Manta Air Base, major U.S. base called drug war. It was cover for counterinsurgency, potential intervention. You may recall that in his electoral campaign, Correa was asked about the Manta Air Base and said, he had a good answer. He said he would allow it to remain if the United States would allow Ecuador to have an air base in Miami. In that sense, that's a sign of the successful defiance which is spreading and is quite unwelcome in Washington. Washington has had in the past basically two techniques of control, violence and economic strangulation, and both are declining in effectiveness. Ridding themselves of the IMF, Kushner's words, that's one form of weakening of the effectiveness of economic strangulation. Same is true of integration, and also of South-South integration, relations between Brazil, India, South Africa, more diversification in export and investment, European Union, China, even though the U.S. is still far ahead. That's all happening, and it permits degrees of successful defiance that would not have been accepted in the past. In fact, the last time the other mode of controlled violence is also declining, as Ecuador's decision a couple of days illustrates. The last time the U.S. supported a military coup in South America was in 2002, and it failed very quickly, in large part because of Latin American opposition. That's quite a change from the fairly recent past. Now, the U.S. is not abandoning these tools by any means. Training of Latin American officers has increased very sharply. It's also been shifted from the State Department to the Pentagon, which is of some significance. When the training is under State Department control, at least in theory, there's supervision and conditionalities, human rights and other conditionalities, and that be very effective, but at least there. When it's under Pentagon control, there's no control. There's no supervision, anything goes. And in scale and character, and that's now increasing substantially in scale. Also, it's explicit what the mission is. it's directed against what's called radical populism. Well, in the Latin American context, radical populism has a meaning. It means priests organizing peasants, human rights activists, labor leaders, in fact, anyone who's disturbing good order. So that tool is not gone, but it's very much weaker than before. Without continuing to take too long, the possible progress in Latin America towards overcoming the internal problems severe, towards further integration, which is a real prerequisite for independent development, and towards escaping the external forces, which are often extremely harmful. The obstacles are serious, daunting, but there's a good chance that much of South America can look forward to a brighter future. It's a good time to recall some words of Ignacio Curia, rector of the Jesuit University in El Salvador, long before he was murdered by U.S.-run state terrorist forces, along with 6 of his colleagues. He said, "If we are not a new world, nor a new continent, at least we are clearly and verifiably, if not by those beyond our shores, we are clearly and verifiably a continent of hope." And I think those words have considerable resonance today, a lot more than when he announced such clarity.
How do you solve the antagonism between popular movements and the middle class in Latin America?
It's a hard problem. First of all, what do we mean by the middle class exactly? In the United States, in U.S. rhetoric and ideology, the term has lost all meaning. The United States is the only major society that I know of where the word class is rated X. So if you look at, say, census studies, most countries where there's social and political studies listed, you have people reported by class, not the United States. In the United States, there's only 2 classes, middle class and criminal class. If your father's a janitor, you're middle class. He's in jail, you're underclass. So we have to ask first what do we mean by middle class. If we mean the relatively wealthy, well, yes, there's going to be a conflict between them and popular movements. So in fact, take, say, Bolivia, the case I mentioned, where it's very, very serious. There is a mostly white, rich, elite chaps sitting on most of the resources, which has ruled the country. And is now challenged by the fact that they had a democratic election for the first time, first successful one, in which the majority of the population, Indians, who rich, strong, who now run the country. They don't like it. In fact, there are all moves towards secession. And they don't have any internal documents. And I'd be very surprised if the U.S. isn't backing those moves. Towards some sort of secession of eastern Bolivia, where the rich are concentrated and where the resources are concentrated. So yes, we call that a conflict between popular movements and the vast majority, the large majority of the population, and the rich, white, westernized elites who are used to running the place. And it could lead to something like civil war. Possible that some of the things are happening elsewhere in Venezuela, but for sure it's a real conflict. And it's an internal conflict that has to be overcome. South America has the advantage that we don't have. That there are popular movements that can stand up for their rights and act for it. They don't have to take the position, the more or less desperate position of Americans. 95% of whom wish that the government would listen to them. 80% of whom believe that the government's run by a few big interests looking after themselves and for the people, and another 80% probably think that we've gone the wrong way, but we can't do anything about it. where there are popular movements, you can do something about it. And it's been done here in the past. That's why we have the freedom and privilege that we enjoy, because it was done in the past. But now the country is disintegrated, so it's not being done. So yes, I think we have a the poorest country in the hemisphere. Second to Brazil, the mass popular youngest workers movement, maybe the most important popular movement in the world, and others for instruction in democracy promotion. But that's not to say that they don't have an easy path. There aren't any movements that are an easy path.
What is your impression about the current Venezuelan situation and the left-wing governments in Latin America, such as the Argentina?
It really doesn't matter what my opinion is. What matters is what Venezuelan opinion is. I mean, I have plenty of criticism. Something's good, something's bad, and so on. But if there's enough time, I could talk about it. But the important fact is it just doesn't matter. What matters is what do Venezuelans do? And that we know, because there are regular polls, like the Latino Barometer polls, which I mentioned, which can't be reported here and aren't, except in one respect I mentioned, because they show that Venezuela ranks very high, in fact, right at the top in South and Latin America, in popular support for the government, optimism about the future, and so on. And that's unacceptable here. So therefore, it's reported. What is reported is that Chavez is a tyrant, amassing power to himself, very fluent at attacking the United States, playing games with Iran, and so on, all of which has an element of truth to it. And no matter how vulgar propaganda is, there's usually an element of truth to it. And here there is too, but it's really not for us to decide. It's for Venezuelans to decide.
How would you explain the near absence of Latin American issues in the electoral race in the U.S.?
Well, there's a more general point which subsumes this. In fact, it's understood on what's called Super Tuesday, February 5th, the day when there are 22 primaries. Take a look back at the Wall Street Journal on Super Tuesday, February 5th. Take a look at the front page and pick it up on the internet. There's a big story covering half the front page where the headline is something like this. It says, issues received in 08 campaign, voters prefer character. So it's sort of true, but not entirely. Issues didn't recede because they were never there. In fact, it's kind of a principle of American electoral campaigns that you keep issues to the side. There's a good reason for that. We know that on major issues, domestic and international, both political parties are well to the right of the population. So therefore, it's there to keep issues out of the race. So issues didn't exactly recede, they never were there. And it's not, we don't know that voters prefer character. All we know is that's what the party managers and the PR representatives present them with. So yes, there's no choice but to prefer character. Are American voters different from Bolivians? And there they seem to care about issues. And who's known about it? I think the same talking to here. I think the same would be true if we were the kinds of popular organization that made participation possible. So like unions. Latin America is not an issue, just like nothing else is. Is Iran an issue? Is Iraq an issue? It's not an issue because people mention it, but the candidates on all these issues are well to the right of the population. They have to do a research group. Let's take Iran, the next big possible major conflict could be a horrendous atrocity. And the public has opinions. By about 3 to 1, the public thinks that we should drop all threats against Iran and enter into diplomacy and normal relations. Actually, the public thinks the same thing about Cuba. These polls began to be taken about 3 decades ago. A large majority of the public thinks we ought to enter into normal relations with Cuba. Well, same with Iran. Drop the threats, enter into normal relations. A large majority of the public, around 75%, think, which is high for the poll makers, think that Iran should have all the rights of any signer of the non-proliferation treaty, being nuclear energy, but not nuclear weapons. Okay? We read in the press here that Iran is defying the world on uranium enrichment. Standard phrase. It's true in a funny sense of the world. It's the non-aligned countries, which are a large majority of the world, vigorously support Iran's right to uranium enrichment. They're not part of the world. The American population supports it, but they're not part of the world either. What's the world is political elites in Washington. That's the world. They're allies. And in fact, if you take a look at candidates, they insist on maintaining threats, and they insist that dropping its non-proliferation treaty rights is a precondition for any further discussion. So they separate themselves from the American people and the rest of the world. A large majority of the population here, again about 75%, are in favor of establishing a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East, including Iran, Israel, forces deployed there, and so on. Well, probably very few people know that that's the Iranian position. For several years, they have been proposing a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. Well, they have the support of a large majority of Americans here for that. But the people who are answering those polls don't know anything that I'm telling you, unless they've carried out an individual research project or part of some of the popular movements here. And incidentally, the U.S. and Britain are committed to that, though they won't admit it. When they tried to construct a thin legal basis for the invasion of Iraq, the resort was to the UN Security Council Resolution 687, which you can look up. The U.S. and Britain claimed that Iraq wasn't living up to it. They insisted that they eliminate weapons of mass destruction, and they haven't done it. But there's another article of 687 which says that we have to establish a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. They find a candidate saying anything like this. It's almost inconceivable. The candidates are so far to the right of the population that the issues can't even be mentioned. Well, the same true of Latin America. The kinds of developments in Latin America that I described just can't be mentioned. So yes, issues are out of the campaign. The Wall Street Journal is correct, except they said they receded. They didn't recede because they were there. And that's pretty characteristic of American elections. The candidates are sold. They're marketed by public relations firms. In fact, the same firms that market commodities. And just as advertising is designed to undermine markets, it's also designed to undermine democracy. In fact, we all know that. I mean, take a course in economics that'll teach you that markets are based on informed consumers making rational choices. Have you ever looked at an ad on television? And is it trying to create an informed consumer making a rational choice? On the other contrary, it's trying to construct poorly informed, uninformed consumers who will make irrational choices. Every ad is like that. Same with candidates. You sell a candidate. You don't want informed consumers making rational choices. What you want is people paying attention to what's called character, qualities, personality, see a nice guy, that sort of thing. Not issues. It's very dangerous, and not Latin American.
We have many insightful questions from a very insightful audience, but I think we are running out of time. And I would like to thank you very much for having been here. And we truly hope to see you again in the future.
Sorry, I got rushed.